Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. During the question and answer session of today's call, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1, record your name, and your line will be open. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would like to now introduce Mr. Andrew Yates from the Census Bureau. You may begin when ready. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. So again, my name is Andy Haight. I'm with the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm an economist at the Census Bureau at our headquarters office here in Maryland. And today we're going to be doing an update on the data that we have released from the 2017 Economic Census for 7 states: Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. So since we are going to be covering so many states, I'm going to provide a little bit of information about some of the selected findings, key findings for these 7 states, but I very much would encourage you all to check out the data in more detail at your leisure. So today's webinar is part of a 20-part webinar series that we have been conducting every 2 weeks. On Tuesdays, every other week, we've been doing state-based webinars. So as you can see, we started out with some of the New England states. Today we are covering, again, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Minnesota, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be closing out the state-based webinar series with the final states that we will be releasing data for. I do want to make a quick mention that while it's not on this list, when we complete the Geographic Area series, we will also be republishing the national level data that we first published back in September of last year as part of our first look. So for those of you who have been doing comparisons between your state and the national total, I would encourage you all to re-download those new revised national level numbers that will now accurately represent the sum of all the states up to that national total. On Thursdays, we have been conducting our our NAICS sector-based webinars. So last week, or 2 weeks ago, we did one on the accommodation and food services sector. Thank you to all of you who attended that one. And then this Thursday, we're going to be conducting, I think, going to be a great one on the wholesale trade and the retail trade sector in the U.S. These are 2 of the largest sectors in the U.S. economy, and there's a lot of sort of interesting findings that we have found already in looking at that data. Finally, we'll be closing out those sector-based webinars with the information on the management of companies and enterprises sector, which is NAICS 55. This is what we all typically think of as company headquarters. And then finally, we'll be closing out the entire series with covering data on the mining, construction, and manufacturing sectors. Okay. So with that, let's get started. So let's talk a little bit about the Census Bureau. I'm sure by now you all have heard that we are in the midst of conducting the largest undertaking that we do at the Census Bureau every 10 years. The Constitution requires us to do a complete count of everybody here in the United States every 10 years. And in December of this year, we'll be releasing to the President our PL files, the public law files that give information on the population in the U.S. that is used for apportionment purposes. The decennial census is certainly our largest undertaking, but it is far from the only thing that we do at the Census Bureau. In fact, we conduct more than 130 different monthly, quarterly, and annual programs each and every year. They include, excuse me, the demographic surveys like the decennial census and the American Community Survey. For those of you who are not familiar with the ACS, I would very much encourage you all to check it out. It is our most detailed demographic survey that we conduct at the Census Bureau and publishes thousands of variables about American population. They even have data on housing, so it's a great program. But we also conduct a number of business surveys. And this is the part of the Census Bureau that I have spent my 33 years at Census working in, and that's the section of Census that I know the most about. So when I think about the 58 business surveys that we conduct, the pyramid on the right-hand side provides a nice visual to understand not only the hierarchy of our monthly and quarterly surveys versus our annual surveys versus our economic census that we do every 5 years, but it also gives you some information about the level of detail that is shown in each of these programs. At the very top of the pyramid is our most timely surveys, the monthly and quarterly programs. When you're sitting at home watching the evening news, the reporter comes on and says, the Commerce Department announced today that monthly retail sales for the month of June were X. That data actually came from the monthly retail trade survey that we conduct at the U.S. Census Bureau. It is a very timely survey, but it produces fairly limited amounts of detail. Data are only shown in that survey at the national level, and they are shown just for a few selected variables, primarily really retail sales. The second tier of the pyramid is our annual programs. These are done not quite as timely as the monthly and quarterly surveys, but they produce more detail. And finally, at the bottom of the pyramid is our baseline benchmark survey, the Economic Census. Were it not for us conducting a comprehensive economic census of every employer business in the United States every 5 years, we wouldn't have the complete universe of every known business for which to draw from our sample surveys for the monthly and quarterlies and our annual programs. So this is a very important program. I know many of you are probably thinking, wow, you're talking about the 2017 economic census and here we are in 2020. Why does it take you guys so long to get this done? We did have some budgetary challenges at the start of the collection process of the economic census, and then we had a little thing called a government shutdown that further delayed the releases. So we are essentially about 9 months behind where we normally would be at the same time for other prior economic censuses. So as I mentioned, the economic census is our most detailed program, and it is the most detailed business survey in a number of respects. First, it publishes the most detailed industry breakouts. We publish data using the North American Industry Classification System codes, or the NAICS codes, and in the economic census, we publish data for nearly every 2 through 6 digit code. We do have a couple of exclusions. For example, we do not publish data on the agriculture sector, which is NAICS 11, because the U.S. Department of Agriculture does. I've also provided a link here to the other exclusions that we have. For example, we don't publish data on colleges and universities because the National Center for Education Statistics does. We don't publish data on governments, on state and local governments, because the Census of Governments does. So I would encourage you all to check out this link. And as a reminder, all of the materials from today's presentation, the recording, the transcript, and the PowerPoint file itself will be provided to you later up on our website. The Economic Census is also our most detailed program in terms of geography. The census not only produces data at the national and state level, like our monthly and quarterly and annual programs do, but we also publish data for metropolitan areas, a variety of flavors, if you will, of metropolitan areas, counties and county equivalents. So, for example, parishes in Louisiana, municipios in Puerto Rico, census areas in Alaska. Those are all covered by our economic census or the economic census of island areas. And we even publish data down to what we call an economic place. Now, when I refer to the term economic place, what I'm referring to is 2 things. First, I'm referring to incorporated cities, or what we typically think of as a municipality. The Census Bureau publishes data for every municipality in the United States that has at least 2,500 population. So these are legal entities. However, we also publish data on something called a census-designated place, or a CDP. CDPs are areas that have sort of a well-identified, well-known, well-established boundary, but are not an incorporated area. They are not a legal entity. Where I live in Maryland, in Anne Arundel County, there is only one incorporated city in the entire county. That is the city of Annapolis. The city of Glen Burnie, Maryland, which is nearly as large, some would argue even larger, than the city of Annapolis, is not an incorporated city. It is actually considered a census-designated place. So again, we publish data in the Economic Census on both those municipalities as well as for census-designated places. The third thing that the Economic Census has going for it that is very unique to the Econ Census is we publish a variety of other dimensions other than industry and geography. I get a lot of questions about data on small business. And I always ask people, well, what do you mean by a small business? Do you think of a small business as a single business location that is small, or do you think of it as terms of a company that is small, a company that might have multiple business locations? Do you think of small in terms of employment size, how many employees they have, or do you think of small in terms of revenue or sales? In the Economic Census, we publish data all four ways. We have data broken out by employment size and by revenue size, and we have data broken out by establishment and by firm. So if your definition, for example, of a small business is a single business location that has fewer than 5 employees, we have data on that in the Economic Census. We also publish a variety of other dimensions, including things like legal form of organization and even franchise status. So when we talk about the accommodation and food services sector that we covered 2 weeks ago, this is a sector that we can all think of as being very involved, very much engaged in franchising. When we think about food services businesses, many of them are the national franchises that we can think of. We publish data on franchise status. And these data can be really useful to entrepreneurs, or restaurateurs, for example, that are interested in opening a restaurant to compare the demographics, the economic characteristics of franchise businesses versus non-franchise businesses. Am I going to have to pay my employees more if I am a franchise, or am I going to be able to pay them potentially less? What's the average payroll per employee of a franchise restaurant versus a non-franchise restaurant? So those types of data are available in the Economic Census. It's also our most detailed program in terms of the data variables that we show. For every single type of business, we publish 4 basic statistics. Number of establishments, that's a single physical location, employment, payroll, and some measure of output, whether that output is sales, shipments, receipts, revenue, or work done. We publish detailed data on the output of the business. But we also publish additional sector-specific data variables. So, for example, in the manufacturing sector, we publish detailed information on the inventories of that business. How much of their inventories are finished goods, work-in-progress goods versus material inventories? What is their starting inventories versus what is their end-of-year inventories? Capital expenditures, assets, depreciation, etc. So it's an amazing wealth of business data published in the Economic Census. Many of our services sectors publish data on expenses. What are the expenses of businesses? Now, the next bullet here is sort of an important one because we not only publish the data on the total output of a business, but we also ask businesses to report the individual products and services that they provide. So, for example, if you wanted to look at tobacco product sales by industry in the state of Maryland, and you wanted to find out how much tobacco products are sold by convenience stores versus sold by big box retailers versus sold by grocery stores, those detailed products, tobacco products as a product line, that detailed data is collected and published in each of the major types of businesses that typically sell tobacco products. So as you can imagine, we tailor those product lines based upon the type of business. The questions we ask a grocery store about the baked goods and the produce and the poultry and beef products, et cetera, that they sell are quite different than the product lines that we would ask a doctor's office. This is great data, and at the end of the presentation today, I'm going to let you know when the new product lines data will start coming out as part of the Economic Census. Now, in terms of where all this great data gets published, we are releasing our data for the very first time on our brand new data.census.gov platform. We'll mention this again at the end of the presentation, but it's also available in a number of other tools, including Census Business Builder. Now, some of you who are familiar with the Economic Census know that we have historically conducted a variety of other surveys associated with the Economic Census, conducted on the same years as we do the Economic Census. One of them is a survey called the Survey of Business Owners, and I have a little note about it here at the bottom of the slide. SBO was conducted every 5 years, on the same years as we conduct the Economic Census, and it published detailed information on the race, ethnicity, gender, and veteran status of the business owner. Now, users really loved this survey because it helped them understand the demographics of the owners of these businesses. If I was interested in knowing, for example, how many Hispanic-owned grocery stores are there in Hudson County, New Jersey, I could get that data from the Survey of Business Owners. People loved the data, but the only thing that they really sort of moaned about was that it was only available every 5 years. So we added a survey called the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs, an annual program that gave some of the similar information that was available in SBO, but not quite the same thing. I'm very happy to report that we just released a brand new replacement for both of these programs, both SBO and ASC. The Annual Business Survey, or ABS, provides data that's similar to what used to be available in both SBO and ASC, and as its name implies, it's an annual program. So I would encourage you all to check out ABS when you get a chance. Now this, what you're seeing here on the slide, is our release schedule. Because we release so much information from the Economic Census, it takes us a long time to get it all out. We started releasing data from the Economic Census in September of last year with something called the First Look Report. I mentioned this just a moment ago. This report provided national level data only, which will now be superseded once we complete releasing the Geographic Area Statistics reports. Now, looking at the schedule, you can see that we started this release in January, and according to this schedule here, it's scheduled to be completed in November, but I do have it on good authority that it is likely we will complete the series early. Fingers and toes crossed, potentially even as early as August. So I would encourage you all to bookmark this release schedule. I have provided the link here at the bottom of the slide, so you can go in and see what's available and when is it coming out. Now, because we flow out the geographic area statistics data on a state-by-sector basis, helping users understand what's been released and what hasn't been is really important. So on this release page, we have this Geographic Area Series Release Resources section. On this section, we have some information about what has been released and what's coming soon. The What's Been Released Excel file gives us a cumulative list of every single state and sector that have been released so far, and the upcoming releases tells users what's coming in the next 30 days. In between those two resources is the map, the little hex map that you're seeing on the right-hand slide. And what this map is displaying is what states and what sectors have we released so far. Now, as you can tell, as of June 11th, we had released something, at least one or more sectors, for every single state in the nation. In fact, we just recently released the data for Texas and Oklahoma and Florida and Georgia and then some of our other southern states. Those data just came out. Now, as more and more data are available for a given state, the peach fill on this graphic starts to grow. And once we have released all of the data for a particular state, then the entire hex will be filled with that peach color. Now, as you can see on this graphic, we've released about 74% of the total data, But many of you are saying, okay, I'm happy that all these states are available, but what I care about is specifically data for my state. I want to know what's been released for the state of Illinois, and I want to be able to go right to the data for the state of Illinois. So at the very top of this visualization, you can see a little drop-down menu where you can choose a particular sector. So let's say I'm interested in understanding the healthcare sector in the state of Illinois. I can go to this menu, this select a sector from this menu option, and I can choose healthcare from that option. And the map will then refresh and it will show all the states that we have released healthcare data for. When I then click on the sector, click on the shape for Illinois, I then get a little link. And when I click on that link, it brings me right into the data in our brand new data.census.gov hub, our brand new platform. So for those of you who have maybe struggled a little tiny bit getting to the economic census data in data.census.gov, this is a really nice shortcut that allows you to get to that data. And let me go ahead and I'm going to show you this just for a second here. So here is our Census Bureau's website. And if I go to Economic Census and then choose the economic release schedule information here on the left-hand side, I then come to that page that we were just looking at. And here is that visualization. You can see my colleagues just updated this morning to reflect the data that we've released as of June 18th. And in our example here, I'm interested in looking at the healthcare sector in Illinois. So I click open this menu, I choose healthcare and social assistance. Now I can see that we have released 100% of the data for that particular sector. So now when I click on Illinois, I now get this list of what's been released. We can see here we've released the healthcare and social assistance sector data. And if I now click on this link here, what is now going to happen is the application is going to go in and it is going to jump right to the healthcare sector data for the state of Illinois. Now you'll notice over here on the left-hand side, the data are presented at the 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6-digit NAICS level. So the full NAICS hierarchy is presented. We also have data broken out by tax status. So you can see we publish data on all establishments as well as establishments that are subject to federal income tax and exempt from federal income tax. These two categories, subject to and exempt from, is as close as we get at the Census Bureau to profit, nonprofit. We do not publish data in our economic census on profit businesses or nonprofit businesses, but this is about as close as we get. For the most part, businesses that are exempt from federal income tax are nonprofits, and businesses that are subject to federal income tax are for-profit businesses. It's not 100% true. There are some cases of rare cases where it's the opposite, but this is a reasonably good proxy. Now you can see this has automatically brought us to the data for the state of Illinois. And you may be saying, okay, great, Andy. You brought me to this data, but I don't want the data specifically for the state of Illinois. I want to look at the data for the city of Chicago or for Cook County. How do I do that? How do I now get to that? Well, once I'm here, I can go to this Geographies menu. I can then choose County. I then can choose Illinois from the list. And I can choose Cook County from the list. Here we are. And when I now close this menu here, the application is now going to refresh, and now we're going to see data both for the state of Illinois and Cook County. And I can select multiple geographies. I can select all the counties in Illinois. So it's a really nice way to get from our website that talks about the data that is available, that we've released so far, and what's been published, and actually get to the data itself. So when we talk about the economic census is a really important program from us because we tend to apply a lot of changes every 5 years when we conduct the economic census. Many of you are unaware of the fact that the boundaries of the geography that we typically think of in our communities are not static. They change. We haven't added a state to the U.S. in a long time, but even the boundaries of counties change. Metropolitan area boundaries gain and lose counties based upon commuting patterns. And certainly our cities and towns have all kinds of boundary changes due to annexations or de-annexations or a variety of other changes. I remember when I was taking one of my first statistics classes at Syracuse University, being an economics major, I remember my professor harping on me that whenever you're making comparisons of data over time, you have to make sure that the thing that you're comparing is comparable. And boy, have I taken his advice to heart in my career at the Census Bureau. When you are comparing data for a particular city or town, and you want to be able to understand what's going on in my city or town, how is the economy of Crofton, Maryland growing, or is it shrinking? When I'm comparing that data over time, I want to make sure that the thing I'm comparing is comparable. So as part of the economic census, we not only apply all the geographic area changes that have occurred since the last economic census, but we also provide materials that help you understand what are those geographies that have changed. And in the next couple of slides, we'll actually look at the changes in geography that have occurred for each of the 7 states that we're going to cover today. Now, while it's not a geographic change, we have also dropped the zip code level data that we used to publish as part of the economic census. And some of you may be saying, oh boy, that's such a bummer. I can't believe you guys dropped that. That was really great data. It's really not that big a deal because we continue to publish something called the Zip Code Business Patterns Program. In fact, in my 32 years at the Census Bureau, I have only in a handful of times referred data users to the economic census zip code-based data because we have annual zip code data available from the ZBP. Now, the one bummer that is here is that we are not publishing place, city, town, village, borough level data for the manufacturing sector anymore. And the reason why that has happened is somewhat related to the second to last bullet on this entire list. As you all know, the Census Bureau is committed to protecting the privacy of businesses and people who respond to our surveys. When we are applying our disclosure rules, we often have to suppress data for a particular industry and a particular geography because there may be so few businesses in that industry or in that geography that we can't publish the data without disclosing their identity. So for example, let's say my colleague Erlene and I own the only 2 gas stations in the little small town that we live in. If Census published the data on place level data on grocery stores or gas stations, in our town, Erlene could easily subtract her employment and her payroll and her sales from the total and know exactly how many employees I have, know exactly what I pay them, and know exactly how much my business earns. That would be a clear violation of the privacy law, Title 13 of the U.S. Code. And because of some new disclosure rules that we are now having to apply in the economic census and our other business surveys, we've decided to drop the place level data from the manufacturing sector because there would be so many cases, even in big cities, where we had to suppress the data for the manufacturing sector where, because of suppressions, because of disclosure, that we decided to just simply not actually going to be publishing that data. Now, every 5 years, we also make changes to the North American Industry Classification System, and those NAICS codes. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then finally, this census, we are adopting a brand new way of publishing our product lines data using something called NAPS, the North American Product Classification System. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So let's talk a little bit about those changes. And again, I want to stress to you all that understanding geographic change is not only important when you're comparing economic census data for 2017 to 2012 or any of our other business surveys, but it's also important when you're comparing our demographic data over time. And for that matter, it's important for when you're comparing any data from any source over time. In nearly every data product that's out there, data are published using the latest boundaries of the geography that they're measuring. When a particular company publishes data for a particular industry in a certain county, they're publishing data on the businesses that are located in that county. Well, if the boundaries of that county have changed, it would be very important to know that. So these resources that we're going to be talking about today are very important, not just for comparing Census Bureau data over time, but others. So I will get off my soapbox, and I will now just tell you sort of where those changes are. So in Illinois, there actually is one metropolitan area that has changed between 2012 and 2017. The code for the Peoria-Canton combined statistical area did change. It used to be called Code 426. Actually, this is a mistake on my slide here. Now it's 427. It's not a big deal for most users because when you search for Peoria-Canton, you're going to find that same geography. But often the titles of metropolitan areas change, and that leads to a code change because the code is used to physically sort those geographies in alphabetical order. So if the city of Canton grew and got to be larger than Peoria, and the title of this Illinois metro had to change from Peoria-Canton to Canton-Peoria, obviously C appears before the letter P, so they'd have to recode the title. Now, sometimes there could be no content change. In this case, there was just a code change, no content change. But understanding this is important because you would then need to know this when you're comparing data over time. Now, of all the places we published in Illinois, 520 of them had some type of boundary change or some type of other change. 308 of them had area gain, 198 of them had area loss. They ceded area, if you will, to a neighboring area. There were no places that had a name change. There are 12 brand new places. On the right-hand side, the top table lists those 12 places that we are publishing for the very first time. And there were 7 places in the bottom right-hand corner that we are dropping. Now, sometimes adds and drops are due to population growth or decline. So, for example, in the village of Seneca, that village may have grown a little bit over time, and now in that 5-year period, they now have more than 2,500 people that live in the village of Seneca where they didn't live in there before. So now Seneca Village qualifies to be part of the Economic Census, where it used to not qualify to be separately published before. Now, businesses that are located in Seneca Village that weren't separately published were still published in the Economic Census, but they were published in something called the balance of county. So when we think about the county that Seneca Village, or counties in this case, that Seneca Village is located in both Grundy County and LaSalle County, when we published LaSalle County, we published the LaSalle County places that were recognized, and then businesses that were outside of those recognized towns were published in the balance of LaSalle County. So a lot of times these area gains and area losses are due to areas of land that have been incorporated into an incorporated city that have been disincorporated. There's a variety of reasons why places can have area gain or area loss. Now, what you're looking at here on the slide is a screenshot of some information that we have up on our Economic Census website. In the upper right-hand corner, I provided to you all a link to our geographic reference information that includes not only these change notes that list what are the added and dropped places, but it also lists what are those places that had area gain and what are those places that had area loss. Now, there is a perception amongst some users that only small towns have area gain and area loss, that the larger cities tend to be pretty static and don't change their boundaries. That is not true. For example, in the state of Illinois, Joliet, Illinois, a pretty big city in the state, gained area, and the fair city of Chicago lost area. So when you're comparing data for Chicago over time, you got to be aware of the fact that the boundaries of Chicago actually changed. It's actually smaller than what it used to be. And when you look at these reference materials, you can then make the decision yourself. Is that change that has occurred, is it significant to me, or is it not significant? And that really then brings us to the other resource that we have. At the bottom of the slide is our TigerWeb Econ tool that allows you to view these changes on a map-based interface. And I'll tell you, this is a great way to look at those boundary changes. The area of Chicago that had a reduction was a very small sliver on one side of the city. And to me, the data user, a data nerd, that sliver, albeit small, may be significant to me. So to me, I'd say, nope, I can't compare data for Chicago over time because the boundaries aren't the same. But maybe to you, that boundary change is so small that you're like, yeah, okay, it doesn't need to be perfect to be good. I'm going to say that it's comparable. That we provide those materials to you. And I would, again, encourage you all to check out this geographies page in the upper right-hand corner and this TigerWeb Econ tool to be able to view those changes on a map. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through the other 6 states. I know you don't want to spend a whole ton of time on this. Indiana did not have any metropolitan area changes, but like Illinois, it had a number of economic place changes, area gain, area loss, etc. Periodically, we do have places that changed their name. So the town of Fishers, Indiana, is now the city of Fishers. It actually changed classification from a town to a city. So now you'd see that actually had a name change. And again, like Illinois, these changes affect small towns and big cities. Fort Wayne gained area, and Muncie, Indiana, lost area. For the state of Kansas, there were no metropolitan area changes, but again, a pretty decent number of places that had area gain and area loss. Kansas City, Kansas, for example, gained area, and Osage City, and I may be pronouncing that poorly, I apologize if I did pronounce it incorrectly, lost area. For the state of Minnesota, Minnesota did have 2 metropolitan area type changes. There's now a brand new Fairmont micropolitan statistical area and a brand new Grand Rapids micropolitan statistical area. Micropolitan areas are defined by a smaller population than what a metropolitan area would have, but they still have some of the same commuting. So you have people that live outside of Grand Rapids that now travel into the city of Grand Rapids, and when that population and when the commuting grows enough to now qualify to be considered a metro, in this case a micropolitan statistical area, that classification occurs. And again, we had place level changes in Minnesota as well. The city of Duluth, Minnesota had area gain, and the city of Minneapolis actually lost some area, ceded some area to a neighboring town. In Missouri, there were no metropolitan area changes, but again, we have a mixture of area gain and area loss. An example in Missouri, Joplin gained area and Kansas City, Missouri lost area. Changing over to North Dakota, there were no places that we dropped and 4 brand new places that now qualify. You can see the 4 of them listed here on the right-hand side. And again, no metropolitan area changes. In North Dakota, Bismarck actually gained area, and Beulah, North Dakota, lost area. And then finally, our last state, Wisconsin, that we're going to talk about today, had no metropolitan area changes, and again, a mixture of places that had area gain, area loss, 2 towns that switched from being a town to being a village that had a name change, and then a number of new places and some dropped places. In Wisconsin, La Crosse, Wisconsin gained area, and the city of Milwaukee lost area. So again, harp on this the last time, please, 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 whenever you're making comparisons of data over time, make sure the boundaries of the geography that you are comparing are comparable. So that now brings us to NAICS, North American Industry Classification System. We update the NAICS classification system every 5 years. It happens to occur on the same years as we conduct the Economic Census, and it is a 3-country agreement. It was developed by the Office of Management and Budget here in the United States, but also Stats Canada and Mexico's statistical agency, INEGI. So when you're comparing data between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico using the NAICS codes, you can be assured that at the 2 through 5-digit NAICS code level, the data are in fact comparable because the 3 countries have to work together to come up with this classification system. This system was adopted in 1997, and periodically I get questions from users, Andy, what about SIC? I know that there are still some data providers out there that publish data on the SIC basis. To be quite frank and maybe a little blunt, I have no idea why these providers are still publishing data on an SIC basis. Yes, it is nice that you can now look at SIC-based data back to the 40s, but there are entire activities of the U.S. economy that had no home under the old SIC classification system. When SIC was first developed, there was nothing called the Internet. I have no idea where businesses that are providing Internet services, Internet service providers, for example, where they are classified in SIC. SIC officially died in 1997 and was replaced by the NAICS classification system. Now, every 5 years, when we make changes to NAICS, there are a number of different types of changes, and these are listed here at the bottom of the page. And very quickly, I'm going to go through the 6 sectors that have had changes. So at the top of the slide, you can see a screenshot of some information about the mining sector. We had some changes where pieces of industries were pulled apart to form other industries. So for example, the crude petroleum extraction portion of the crude petroleum and natural gas extraction industry was combined with the natural gas extraction industry that used to be under natural gas crude petroleum was pulled out from that first industry and was given its own NAICS code, crude petroleum extraction. The natural gas extraction that used to be part of that one industry was now combined with natural gas liquid extraction to be natural gas extraction. So when we're comparing data over time for the mining sector, we need to be aware of these NAICS changes. In the bottom right-hand side is the manufacturing changes. You can see there were 4 industries for household cooking, household refrigeration, household laundry, and other major household appliance manufacturing. Those 4 industries in 2012 NAICS have been combined into a single NAICS code for major household appliance manufacturing. Often, when you have a case where industries are combined, it is due to either industry decline or those industries are sort of fading away. We don't make those things. We don't sell those things in the United States anymore. Or in cases where industries have become consolidated. So industry decline is probably why you notice the consolidation of these 4 appliance industries. If you go shopping and look to see the labels on where all of those refrigerators and dishwashers and laundry machines are made, very rarely will you find a Made in the USA label. We don't make those in the U.S., so it's getting harder and harder for us to meet those privacy rules and still publish that detailed breakout, so they've been combined. Industry decline certainly does not explain electronic shopping, electronic auctions, and mail order houses being consolidated into one NAICS code. These industries are all doing fairly well. Certainly electronic shopping is, but they've been combined because so many of the businesses involved in these 3 activities are the same businesses that we just combined them. So that's some of the retail changes. And then finally, the last 3 sectors, the information sector, real estate, rental, and leasing, and the professional, scientific, and technical services sector all had changes. The last sector here, professional, scientific, and technical, this is the only sector where we truly have a brand new NAICS code, where we are now publishing data for an industry that we never had detailed data before, and that is research and development in nanotechnology. This industry has grown to the point that it now warrants, if you will, having its own identity under NAICS. So we now have that kind of detailed information. So now let's talk a little about where you can get to it and actually show you some data. As I mentioned to you before, we are publishing the Economic Census data on our brand new data.census.gov platform. I would encourage you all, if you have not used it yet, if you're still bemoaning the loss of American Fact Finder, to get over it and to check out and use data.census.gov. There are also some really good training materials that some of my colleagues have created, so I would encourage you guys to check that out. Data are also going to be released in the Economic Census in QuickFacts. And in July of this year, we're going to be releasing version 3.1 of Census Business Builder, which will also incorporate the 2017 Economic Census data in it for the first time. As we have been releasing these data, we've been putting out announcements in social media about the releases. And one of the things we thought about doing was doing these little fun facts. What you're seeing here on the slide are just 3 of the fun facts that have been released so far. The top left one is for the transportation sector in Kansas. The top right one is for the healthcare sector in the state of Missouri. And finally, the bottom one, again, for healthcare sector in North Dakota. I would love to take credit for the choice of the 50-state quarters as the image that we put on these slides, but it would not be mine to take that credit for. My colleague, Corey, who created these, did an absolutely wonderful job. I love the quarters. There's some states that I'm just totally enamored. I love the Missouri coin. So thank you, Missouri, for choosing a really lovely looking 50-state quarter coin. Now, I've also provided on this slide a library of all of these visualizations in the bottom left-hand corner. And a couple of months ago, I wrote a story about how the Economic Census measures the changing American economy. And again, we've provided that link there here as well. So you've all been sort of patiently waiting for some findings from the Economic Census. So I'm going to quickly walk through some key data. What I want to point out to you all is all of the slides you're going to be looking at today are looking at data at the state level by NAICS sector, by 2-digit sector. But what I would very much encourage you all to do is to check out these changes to see, is this big growth, for example, in Illinois in the wholesale trade sector, is that growth all happening in Cook County, or is it evenly distributed across each of the counties in the state? Is that wholesale trade big growth that we're seeing on the right-hand chart, is that all concentrated in a relatively small number of individual industries within wholesale trade? So is that grocery wholesalers, or is that auto parts wholesalers, or is that appliance wholesalers, or is it distributed across the different sectors and industries within this wholesale trade sector? So looking at these two charts, you can clearly see that of the sectors that we have published so far, and you will notice that there are a couple of sectors where the bar is not shown. So mining, construction, manufacturing, and management of companies and enterprises, those 4 sectors we have not yet published the detailed data for Illinois for yet. So it'll be interesting to see how wholesale trade compares once we actually have the data for those 4 sectors. And there are 3 sectors that are shown with an NA, utilities, information, and finance and insurance, that we don't publish data at the state level for those particular sectors. But you can clearly see wholesale trade is the dominant industry, the dominant sector in Illinois, with about $583.9 billion in total revenue in that year. Wholesale trade also is the sector that has seen the largest growth between 2012 and 2017. That $583 billion is about $34.7 billion higher than what it was in 2012. So that sector is doing quite well in Illinois. And you can see that in the state, no sectors saw a decline from 2012 to 2017. Again, at least as of the sectors we've published so far. We will see what happens to manufacturing in Illinois when we publish the manufacturing sector. Now in Indiana, we see a similar situation of the wholesale trade sector being the largest sector. Retail trade is not too far behind, but what really is interesting is we do not see the change from 2012 to 2017 in Indiana the way we saw it in Illinois. In Illinois, most of the growth in their economy in that 5-year period of the public sectors was in the wholesale trade sector. But as you can see in Indiana, not only did wholesale trade grow, but so did the retail sector, right behind it, and then just behind there, the healthcare sector and professional, scientific, and technical services. And it's really sort of fascinating to see this because healthcare had been one of our largest growth sectors for a long time, but in this particular 5-year period, you can see how the wholesale and retail sectors have changed. Now looking at Kansas, wholesale trade again is the largest sector. You'll start to see a common theme here. But one thing that I found that was really quite interesting is while that sector is the largest sector in the state, that sector was also the only sector that saw a decline from 2012 to 2017. So the comment that I made earlier about wanting to compare, did that change in the wholesale trade sector, was that all concentrated in a small number of counties in the state or metros in the state, or is it distributed across the state? Is that big change due to a particular industry within wholesale trade having a big change or having a really bad 5-year period? Did a very large wholesaler leave Kansas and cause that big decline? These are the kind of things that I just find fascinating as an economist when I want to then dive into the detail to see what is happening in Kansas and where has that change really occurred. Now looking at Minnesota, again, a common theme with wholesale trade dominating and wholesale trade also seeing the largest increase between 2012 and 2017, with retail, professional, scientific, and technical, and healthcare closely behind. Looking at Missouri, again, that same sort of pattern of wholesale trade having a big increase, wholesale trade being the largest sector and also having a very large increase between 2012 and 2017, about almost $20 billion increase in that 5-year period, with retail trade being right behind it, and again, healthcare next. South Dakota, again, we see a similar pattern as we saw before, with wholesale trade dominating, but once again, we see this big decline in the wholesale trade sector. And what I think you all are going to find when you dive into the data, as I'm encouraging you all to do, is that the change in the wholesale trade sector in these 2 states that we've pointed out where we've had this big change is not distributed across all the industries. It can be attributed to a pretty substantial change in a relatively small number of industries, which really in many ways speaks to how many of our communities in the U.S. are reliant or dependent on a single type of business, a single major employer in their county. And when that employer is doing really well, their economy flourishes. When that big employer pulls out and maybe goes somewhere else, we see a big hit. So it's an interesting aspect of our economy, how we have some communities that are very evenly distributed across the types of businesses that their employment is working in, and in other communities that's not the case. The healthcare sector, as you can see in South Dakota, was the one that had the largest increase in revenue. And again, that's pretty indicative of the way healthcare had been growing for quite a while. And then finally, our last slides here, I have it listed here as Iowa. This is actually Wisconsin, sorry. Again, you can see the wholesale trade sector being dominant, but interestingly, retail actually saw the biggest increase in Wisconsin, followed by healthcare. So let's now close this out. and talk about what's coming after we release these local area data. I mentioned this new product data that we're publishing using the North American Product Classification System. These product line data are scheduled to start coming out in November. And right around that same time, you'll be seeing those new establishment and firm size reports. And then finally, the miscellaneous subjects will come after that. If you are interested in previewing what these product data are going to look like, we do have a NAPS website. I've included the link to the page in the bottom right-hand corner, and I would encourage you all to check that out. Oops, how that got there. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry about that. So again, to summarize, the Economic Census provides an amazing wealth of data, and I would encourage you guys to check out the Economic Census website to learn more about it. The data in these releases are coming out on a flow basis. We're scheduled to be completed in November, although I have it on good authority, it'll be completed a little early. Geography is really important. Please, please, please use our geographic resources to understand geographic change. And finally, check out the NAICS website to learn more about those NAICS changes. So with that, I want to say thank you to you all.